Welcome, everyone. It's so great to see so many familiar faces and to welcome new ones. I'm David Cory, and I'm here with Jill Cory, and we're going to talk about top 10 relationship mistakes leaders make. Now, we had some fun creating this little presentation for you, and we hope to engage you in discussion and do a poll and just talk about some of the leaders that maybe you've also experienced and some of the things that they of course, related to the EQI model. We're going to start off with a poll. 85% saying they've been secretly told something personal about a colleague from a
Mm,
boss.
yeah.
77% said they witnessed a leader giving humiliating feedback to a team member in a meeting. 69% said that they were expected to deal with a distraught employee. 77% said that they had a great idea that a leader claimed as their own, like the person who submitted a it was a union manual, Jill.
Yeah, it was a policy manual.
policy,
that-
a policy manual that made reference to a union that organization didn't even have, and she took it from your office, Jill, and
yeah,
presented it
this
as
is
her own.
mhm,
Crazy stuff.
to the board. Yeah.
So denied vacation time because of work while your boss takes a holiday. Yeah, interesting. So let's take a bit of a deeper dive into these things. So we had this idea of these mistakes, and we looked at 10 of them, and we're going to talk about each relationship mistake, talk about the corresponding beliefs, because this is an interesting aspect of EQ. Is what do people believe when they are behaving the way that they are and acting the way they do? And we'll look at some EQ competencies that correspond, and also talk a bit about the impacts on employees and others within an organization. This is not new to many of you. However, to some of you it might be. So we need to review it each time because we have new people who may not have seen this model before. This is the basis for the emotional quotient inventory, the online assessment tool that we use in our coaching with individuals, and as the basis for our training as well. And so the concept of emotional intelligence is at the center. This is the idea that our brains process emotions and logic at the same time. And then it's about what do you do if you want to be emotionally intelligent? Well, then we've got these 15 emotional skills divided up into 5 categories, and you get a score in each area. And so we want to take a look at which of these correspond to leadership relationship mistakes, and talk about what might possibly be a high score and what might be a low score. And we want to talk about one way to look at and think about these different EQ competencies. This is an example from an actual my report. And so we've got scores that are higher, scores that are lower in many cases, and we want to consider the implications of those high low scores. And Jill does a great job of talking about this idea of EQ, and the idea of a mixing board.
So the idea from the previous slide is that you can see that they look like sliders, and even the scale itself has a low range, mid range, and high range as when you get your results. So we've been thinking a lot about what does it mean to build a range in each of your EQ competencies, meaning that sometimes we need to reach that high note. So if you think about a soundboard, if you push everything up to the top, you just get like obnoxious sound. And if you pull all the sliders to the bottom, you get no sound at all. And if you put them all in a static position, you just get a repeat of the sound. So if we translate that idea, and so what we're looking for in each of those sliders is range. Sometimes we need it high volume, more bass, etc. Um, if you translate that to the EQI and the results, sometimes we need some pushed up to the higher, but we need them in balance across the 15 sliders. So we need to turn down or dial back. Sometimes we need to dial up some competencies to get different results, different impacts, like sound, so that we are not showing up in the same way all the time. I've told many of you this, but I was coaching a senior leader in a grocery chain, and we were talking about this idea of building range and range both within each of the competencies and range across the 15. So, when you get your report, you get your highest three, and those tend to be either our default or our go-to skills that we kind of show up with most comfortably and most often. And so he was saying, oh, it's like bringing the same meal to every potluck dinner. We're like, yeah, there's more than artichoke dip out there, right? So we don't always want to show up with artichoke dip. We want to show up in whichever skills are matching the context, the business process, the relationship, the outcome that we need. So if we could think of those 15 results as a more mobile, three-dimensional, where we're moving things with more intention, rather than just in our default mode or in this kind of static setting that we have. And that's really the goal in EQ, is both to develop each of the skills so that we can reach the high range, but we don't always want to stay in the high range, or we risk having just obnoxious sound. So that's kind of this framework that we're trying to think of how to work with EQ and EQ results in coaching and development work.
And then we thought we'd answer this question: when is high too high? There is an initial assumption that higher is better. Well, what we know is that higher is not always better, and that sometimes high can come across maybe an unintentionally obnoxious way, or not helpful, or not useful for the person involved, and it could be because it is over relied upon, or it's because it's unbalanced by another appropriate EQ competency. When is low too low? Low is too low when it is not being used effectively in a given situation or circumstance. And so once again, as Jill mentioned, we want to be able to dial up and dial down these competencies as needed, and given the situation, the circumstances, and our objectives. When EQ competencies are out of balance, we see some of the mistakes that we're going to take a look at next.
Feel free to be using the chat box for questions,
Yes,
or just raise
please.
your hand. We've set it up as a meeting so we can interact with everybody. So make sure you use that for us.
Yeah, feel free to comment and ask questions. So these are in no particular order. Not David Letterman's top 10, where he used to start with the least important and go to the most important. We didn't place any importance on these. They're just all mistakes. So here's the first one. And we were thought about this because sometimes and it's a frustrating answer, when someone tells you to do something or asks you to do something, and you really want to just understand why. And it's a common parenting technique too. For those of you who are parents, you may have found yourself saying this at one point or another: because I said so. It's a very unsatisfactory response to wanting to understand. And we were trying to think, well, what's the belief underlying that, and then what might be the competencies that could be involved there as well.
And you'll see that they circle around, generally speaking, ideas of leaders as having more power, so in a more hierarchical relationship to team, rather than connection, sense of equality and collaboration, which is a more relationship-oriented way of being with teams. So the leader knows best. I mean, it's also the belief under that is that leaders have authority and leaders shouldn't be questioned. So there's if you kind of unravel it, you see that there are lots of beliefs, but they all circle around this idea of I've earned this position, and I have the right, and I don't want to be questioned, and I don't owe anybody the answer to that. And so to again, this idea of high self-regard, we're trying to build people to have high self-regard, but as Dave was saying in the last slide, what's too high? So maybe too high about self-regard here that would get that would tell the leader that they can just do what they want without kind of accountability. And that's an overuse of self-regard. Like it's a focus on self and and an, and simultaneously lack of focus on relationship or others.
And maybe one point requires clarification, and that is when we say high EQ competency, we're talking about the possibility that someone rates themselves high on the EQI. So it is possible for them to say, hey, I have a really high self-regard, and then not really understand that it's coming across as too much to others. So it's again, it's arrogant, it's obnoxious, or whatever it might come across as, but it's really not serving that person very well to come across in that way.
It's interesting. A couple of people have commented that might it be low self-regard, and David and I actually had that as well as another scenario that it and you'll see that throughout that the very high might be compensation for very low. And the other thing, sort of as Greg's pointing out, if it's out of balance with other things, if empathy isn't there, if interpersonal relationship isn't high, that's when self regard runs the risk of being a dominant feature like this and then dominating the way that this person is interacting in their relationships. Because remember, we're looking at relationship mistakes. So this is about how do I show up in relationship, work relationships here.
Yeah, we're trying to figure out, what could be a low score for this person. Why would they, not be able to or want to provide an explanation? And it could be low stress tolerance. That this is kind of how they, behave under stress. It's like going back to your point, Greg. It's yeah, just do it because I said so, that could be a stress response. So
Mm-hmm.
we don't really know for sure, but we're just trying to hypothesize and sort of make some guesses as to what could be going on here. And yeah, you're absolutely right. It could be many things. Could be low emotional self-awareness, Andrea. Yeah, there's lots of things that could be going on here.
And remember, we would never just look at two. So these are kind of features, I guess, in a way that not just hypotheses, which we are, and we always tell you to hypothesize and then be curious, but also there are two features. And we could have loaded each one up, but we thought we would just kind of, um, for the sake of demonstration, choose one high and one low. So we'll keep going, and you'll hopefully get a little bit of a mix here.
This one was my suggestion to add to the list, and it came from an oil and gas company where a very senior woman told us basically in terms of how emotions are expressed around here. You die before you cry. I never forgot that, and I thought, wow, like that's how unwelcome emotional expression is in this workplace. And then we had some fun trying to figure out, what are the beliefs around that? What do you have to believe for that to become part of the company culture? And then what might be the highs and lows?
So obviously, the belief generally is that emotions are weak, they have no place at work, they're an inferior form of information, inferior or irrelevant, and that they interfere. They interfere with decision making, with problem solving, with productivity, with output and outcomes. And so that's that. Like that those beliefs are all organized around irrelevance and really interference. Um, and so the high EQ competency is independence, right? And that one makes sense to me. It's like I don't need to listen to anybody. I just have to hold my own here. I can't be influenced by anybody. I can't be impacted by anybody. And again, thinking in terms of relationships, there's no connection here. If you believe that you die before you cry and you've got a boss that holds you to that, you're not building relationship. You can't be authentic. You can't show up in your complexity, and so it's this mandate to really just create your own bubble and be insulated and independent. absolutely on the low EQ. We have emotional self awareness and empathy as well. You can't afford empathy because there's no place for it. So there's no allowance to actually care, both care about the person, but also care about the impact that you're having on people.
Yeah, and that belief is really important. In order for you to have no empathy for others, you have to believe that emotion is not part of it. And we're going to look at some other, and it's interesting. We listed these 10, and then we thought, wow, these are all pretty similar. And so you'll find some common themes here, and you're absolutely right, Sheila. It could be low empathy, but low empathy features in many of these. It's like, well, what could be maybe a bit of a differentiator or a way for this person to really understand more about how EQ plays into this mistake that they're making.
Right. And if you think about, again, the topic 10 relationship mistakes that leaders make, obviously the interpersonal composite area, which is interpersonal relationships, empathy, and social responsibility. These are all, you could rate all of those as low. It would be unlikely to make a relationship mistake if those were dialed up.
And I took this image from someone who I don't think they were saying this sarcastically. I think they actually believe this, that real bosses don't let their emotions get in the way of business. And it's interesting. We just finished a 2-day workshop with a global organization, and it was at the end when we went to check out. Frequently,
Mm-hmm.
in the checkout, it was that before they came to the workshop, they didn't think emotions belonged in the workplace. So it's really a common idea out there in workplaces around the world that you really leave your emotions at the door, and emotions shouldn't enter into business decisions in air quotes. It's fascinating, and it really I think what it says is that we've got a long way to go in terms of really understanding emotions and their role, and being more intelligent about them.
Okay, suck it up, princess. I don't know if you can read this. I was shocked when Dave pulled this one up. Sweat dries, blood clots, bones heal. Suck it up, princess.
I've heard it as suck it up, buttercup.
Yeah,
Yeah,
suck it up,
we were
Buttercup.
going to
We
Buttercup, but
debated which one to use, Greg. And this is such a common perspective from senior leaders, and old school traditional senior leaders who really again aren't that fussed by things. They just think that there's a way, like Steve Jobs and his reality bending idea. Everything's possible, and we just need to work harder, push harder, etc. And really not understanding and being really honestly puzzled by the fact that people are struggling with the stress of it all. And so they just keep piling things on people, and expecting them to, again, just suck it up and do what they need them to do. And that belief is really interesting. Um,
yeah. Do you see Michelle's comment? This is white supremacy culture. It certainly has misogynist or patriarchal roots. And again, as we pointed to earlier, that these hierarchies have been self-supporting of privilege and entitlement of, generally speaking, white heterosexual men. And what happens institutionally is now the rules are there for patriarchy, and so women also adopt those same rules. So it doesn't exempt women from these behaviors. Um, we work very hard to socialize people into institutional culture and culture in general. So absolutely, that under the underpinning of this is power and entitlement, for sure, and it's often been the domain of white heterosexual men. Mm-hmm.
So we're thinking about what could be high. Well, stress tolerance, right? That would be a high one for sure, and then low reality testing. So not the inability to be able to, once again, empathy comes in, because it's difficult to see things from other people's perspectives, and the feeling that their perspective is the correct one or the right one.
Some internalize the stress, and that's really what stress tolerance can be at the very high level. Is it's not that they're handling it, it's just that somehow they're not attending to it, and so it's not healthy, and then explodes or implodes on sometimes on themselves and sometimes on other people. And so reality testing also applies to self, right? How am I doing it? And somebody referenced low self-awareness, which is the kind of reality testing is the external checking out, and self-awareness, emotional self-awareness, is the internal checking in. Okay, we've always done it this way. Do you know that? Hello, I'm leaving my comfort zone.
I remember doing some training for a city, and the training was on innovation. And there was a guy who had been with with this particular city his entire career, and he said, 20 years ago, I gave one of my good ideas, and nobody paid any attention, so I've never given them another one. Well, that's not exactly contributing to a more innovative culture, but you hear this a lot, particularly from government and more bureaucratic organizations. We've always done it this way. And Jill's question was, who is us?
Right? Because the us isn't the collective, it's generally a few people at the top who've set the establishment in a certain direction and make final decisions. And they're the ones who reject like an innovative idea at the lower end. So when somebody says it always works for us, the question really is, who is the us?
I love the image. Hello, I'm leaving my comfort zone. It's comfortable, right? We're staying where we know, and it's like that old saying: "The devil you know is better than the devil you don't know." And there may be some truth to that, but really, it keeps organizations safe, but not sort of more adapting to new information. Jill and I always chuckle when they interview someone, and they say that that all this COVID information is so confusing, and they're always changing it. Well, they're changing it because they have new information. They're learning new things. That's why they're changing it. And of course, there's that feeling, right? I just want to keep, and people keep saying things like, I want things to go back to normal. In not and of course it's stressful and difficult and challenging, of course, to embrace the new reality, but that is our reality. So the competencies, we thought perhaps someone who is in this position is very deliberate and controlled. So that very controlled might be a high impulse control score on the EQI. And someone who is very deliberate and very controlled, and may be controlling, is their comfort zone. And then in terms of what the low EQ competency might be, it may well be low flexibility,
Mm-hmm.
among others.
A couple of really interesting thoughts here. One is a TED talk that's referenced. Are you courageous enough to abandon the past? That's awesome. And then also, in what decade was the Weve put into place? Yeah, because some organizations, like the military, have been operating in certain ways for a long time. University institutions are fixed. Oil industry is often fixed with some changes at the margins, but not fundamentally changed. And so it does require courage. And if we were thinking about the opposite, what requires courage to not work in that belief, it's always worked for us, what would be high? What would be a high score there? What would have to be operating, or what things together might be operating for courage? Yeah, and you can really see it these days, as Dave's pointing to in COVID, where people's flexibility is, and if it's been impacted over the last 2 years. Like, did they have higher flexibility, and is it just too much, or is it one of their natural impulses to not want things to change and not cope well with change? Yeah, assertiveness, optimism. Yeah, it's interesting. Dave and I were saying that we don't have optimism anywhere here. Probably we could put low optimism in a few places that where where there's not enough hope to cope with the challenges.
Okay, mistake number 5. Do as I say, not as I do. We thought of Boris Johnson, and the news story about him attending the parties when everyone else was kind of on lockdown and shouldn't have been going anywhere. And then we thought of the belief. And we thought of Novak Djokovic,
Tennis
and
player.
we came up with a new term. We think it's really going to take off. It's stratified entitlement.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, the prime minister has a belief that he is entitled, and he is exempt from the rules and from the expectations of civil society and social responsibility. And you have to have very unhealthy high independence in order to believe that's true, coupled with very low social responsibility, and of course a whole bunch of other things in between. But those are the real polar opposites in this one, where bosses expect certain things of people, but they don't do it themselves. And that was in the poll question, the holiday, where you have to stay and meet deadlines, and they're on a 3-week holiday on business, using business expenses. And that's, when we see a lot of the corporate corruption, it comes from this idea of this stratified entitlement. Reality testing, yeah, absolutely. Very low
Mhm.
reality testing. Did he not think that that might piss some people off? and that's and also entitlement does blind people to reality testing. It's a really important point that you're
Mhm.
making. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
So this one comes from the John F. Kennedy quotation: "The time to repair the roof is when the sun is shining," and I love the quotation because, and I frequently use it in terms of relationships. So sometimes leaders may think that they're going to try to fix the roof in the rain. And what I mean by that is that when it's crunch time, you need a bunch of people to stay for the weekend to meet an important deadline, and you try to call in some favors when really you don't have the relationship yet with those people. You haven't worked on that relationship in the non-crunch time to be able to have them feel okay about putting in that additional discretionary effort, and that's not the time, is in the rain. So when you fix the roof when the sun is shining, you're building the relationship, you're sharing of yourself through your emotional expression, and you're building trust. And the belief here is that someone deserves trust simply because of their position, which is again fits with many of the things that we've talked about, including there's no place for emotion in the workplace. So these are people who don't understand relationships, don't understand trust, don't understand loyalty or commitment.
One of the aspects that we were thinking about that relates here as well is around feedback and performance reviews. That it doesn't go well if you haven't put money in the bank and you need to withdraw it for a difficult conversation. You don't have the relationship there, or the the equity to draw on to have those difficult conversations, or provide critical feedback, because there isn't a balance to it as well. So people who fit this profile only deliver critical feedback, not a range of positive and ongoing feedback.
And sometimes we don't learn, and we end up putting the Christmas lights up when it's freezing cold outside and it's snowing, instead of putting them up earlier in the fall when it would be much more comfortable working outside and doing that.
Okay, so why not? We just want to put you in groups. We've given you 5 or 6 mistakes now. Just have a few minutes to identify things that are coming up for you, thoughts about your own leadership, leaders that you've had. Okay, for the sake of time, we'll just ask you to put things in the chat box in terms of interesting aspects of the conversation you were having, because we want to talk about No Stick Nick. Who was literally a boss of mine. His name was Nick, and Dave and I have different theories about what his EQ profile might have looked like. So Dave's going to talk to us from one side.
Well, yeah, we were thinking about the belief here. Why would Nick not be want to be accountable for anything, and why would he continually blame others for everything? And I was thinking maybe uh, the belief is that conflict is scary or bad. And nothing can be gained from having a different perspective or a differing opinion or a different approach. And maybe the high EQ competency is flexibility. And I'm thinking that because I'm thinking, could go any way, would kind of, be able to sort of, duck and dodge and not let anything stick to him. And then possibly the low EQ competency is self-regard, because if I felt more confident in myself, then I would be able to say, yes, I made a mistake, or I did not do what I was supposed to do, and that sort of thing. But this guy never seemed to. But Jill actually worked with him, so she knows better.
I mean, the other side of it is that they're so untouchable out of, again, the sense of entitlement or arrogance, which would, of course, be high self regard and high independence and low in reality testing, low in empathy. But the profile is really somebody who is never held accountable, that somebody else is always responsible for the problem. Except for the good ideas that he took from me, but well, from the whole team. But overall, um, like they kind of move up the organization, and everybody's watching, like, how's that happening? Because they've been so untouchable and unaccountable. Yeah, like this is a profile where people don't want to be challenged, have their authority challenged, their ideas challenged, their role challenged, and yeah, so
This one comes about from having experienced several of these leaders, and maybe you've experienced them as well. One of them had their own photographs throughout the office. Everywhere you looked, was this individual's photographs on the wall, and people who kind of, everything kind of revolves around their hobbies and their interests and their philanthropy, and so it's kind of like the whole office is riding on the coattails, experiencing all these adventures vicariously through this individual. And I think maybe the belief is, this belief is something that was important in Jill's work, and maybe I'll let her tell you about it.
well, this idea of central, superior, and deserving, when we were working with the men's treatment program for men who are abusive, we had a research project and we interviewed men before and after going through treatment. And one of the things we heard most clearly about why they used abuse was that they felt that they were central, superior, and deserving. And those were fundamental beliefs. And that's why other kinds of treatment programs don't work, because they're deeply held beliefs that they're not really very willing to let go of. And women, on the other hand, who were experiencing the abuse, were working from a relationship paradigm that was much more about equality and connection and sort of mutuality. And both parties think that the other is working from their paradigm. So you can imagine a person in power in a business relationship. They think that everybody else is vying for power, trying to take their role, trying to like kind of step over them. And that's really, if we think about No Stick Nick, that was the threat, is that somebody else, that there was a threat there that somebody else might take over his position or look better than him. And so this idea, we could really translate it to all of the beliefs, that underneath it is a sense of entitlement, central, superior, and deserving. And so there is no room for anyone else in that, because that person thinks that everybody's fighting for the same power. They don't understand relationships. And if you remember the definition of interpersonal relationships in the EQI, it's about mutually satisfying. So it's about connection. It's not about a vertical relationship, a hierarchical relationship. And so those are in juxtaposition to each other.
Go
We
ahead,
were
Jill.
thinking about Trump when we thought about this
Yes.
high emotional expression and low emotional self-awareness, where he had absolute entitlement to say whatever he wanted, true or false, abusive or not, mostly, and no awareness of his own behavior. We could put reality testing in there for sure, and we could put some other things in there: low empathy, low interpersonal relationships, etc. But this is a person, again, in this sort of vein of untouchable, and that these beliefs are so fundamental to who they are that they feel like they can say anything and do anything without accountability.
The belief here for the person who get her done is the mantra. Productivity is the only workplace measure of success. So that with that focus, these are people are quite often high in self-actualization. That really turns their crank and leads to fulfillment for them. They feel very self-satisfied when the productivity is there, when the bottom line a measure is adequate, and maybe the low EQ competency, because they can be very hard on people, is empathy. So they're hard drivers, and again, it is productivity over everything else. Mistake number 10, I had a boss who was always gossiping and telling me about other people, and it was weird. It was all of a sudden one day, after this went on for quite some time, I realized she was probably saying the same things about me to other people. It's like, whoa.
Well, we were kind of interested in the idea as well. Like, what is it about gossip or sharing, kind of like sharing information that isn't accessible to everybody? Is that about power? Do you appear powerful when you have that information? There's maybe some other theories, but I think that's probably rises to the top for us, that there's something about that gives them some status, and what they're doing is not sharing information. They're displaying to you that they have access to these resources. And it's kind of a reminder. We looked up the term gossip, and what was interesting about that is that gossip can also serve to remind people of the rules of the organization as well. So there's an informal network that both connects but reminds people of the rules. So I think that's also interesting. Again, we have high self-regard, that anything that really supports self to an unhealthy high probably fits into self-regard. And then low social responsibility, it's contributing to potentially to a more toxic work environment, and maybe a psychologically less safe environment. And low impulse control, it's like I hear it, I say it, right? People who say, don't tell me a secret because I'll tell somebody, right?
Okay, so we're very quickly interested in what else could have made the top 10. What did we miss?
Every man for himself.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
We wished that we would have added every man for himself. I think it's a fairly common belief among men. I mean, I certainly learned as a young boy. It's kind of like, I'm going to take care of myself, but I don't really have to take care of anybody else. And how this surfaces now is, when Jill goes into the kitchen to make a snack, she makes a snack for both of us. When I go into the kitchen to make a snack, I make it for me. It doesn't even occur to me. And it's like only after the fact, it's like, oh, I'm so sorry. It didn't even cross my mind that you might want one too.
The rule is Dave looks after Dave and Jill looks after Dave. And that's the invisibility of that every man for himself, right? Is that there's a lot of people looking after that person who thinks they have high independence.
I just wrote in the chat, it only has impact if the intention was there. That one, right. Yeah, that one was actually verbalized. It's often experienced, but it was verbalized.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Great one.
Yeah. Which we know is not true, right? Like, motivation is not a measure of impact. Yeah. Melanie makes a really interesting comment. I was waiting for a mistake that someone who's higher in empathy would make. And again, it's a relationship mistake. There are lots of mistakes that where empathy is involved. But most of that is because there's an overemphasis on relationships. And I suppose if taken too far, the mistake is an overemphasis on people and not enough on productivity. Yeah, the common one that I hear from women who score high in empathy and they're in leadership roles is that sometimes it's not that they care too much, but it gets out of balance with work processes and work culture and dynamics. Yeah. And then they end up doing more because it's like, oh, she's just had a new baby. I'll take that on, and sort of their own belief of stress tolerance. Yeah, that's excellent. Well, thank you, everyone. Dave, I think
thanks for being here. Sorry, Jill?
Yeah, just pointing to the slide. We're gonna do a Be My Valentine webinar next month. We're gonna think again about relationships, but on the positive side, what EQ competencies help to build relationships.
Are you going to send us your PowerPoint presentation? Because I think there's some good things in there that.
I
Sure.
thought you were going to say, "Will I send you a Valentine's?" I might.
I know that. You rock the boat too much, though.
And
I would not do well in your organization. Let's just say that for sure.
and I don't know the Enneagram, Greg, but Jill's a 10 in my books. So we know she's not a 9.
And there's no 10.
Yeah. See.
Thanks everybody. Have a great day. Wonderful to be with you. See you next
Excellent.
time.
Thank you.